My dear Divyavani viewers, welcome to the program Word of God. I was giving you the summary of St. Paul's journey, the missionary journeys, 3 of them that he made, wherever he went, he preached the gospel, converted many, baptized many, established Christian communities or churches. I was sharing with you mainly from the Acts of the Apostles from chapter 25 onwards, how he made those travels. Meanwhile, the Jews complained against him, and that was taken up by the governor. He listened to the complaints. He listened to Paul's defense, especially whatever the Jews accused Paul of. The governor said, "I am not competent to take a decision on this." He asked Paul, "Are you ready to go to Jerusalem and face the trial?" Paul appealed to Caesar, and he said, "I will follow whatever Caesar says." And that was granted. Paul was given that chance to appeal to Caesar directly. And the governor said, "I will send you at the earliest to Rome." And that was done. Paul was sent to Rome by a ship where he could defend himself before Caesar. The journey was very hard. The ship first went by Sidon. It looked everything was okay, but then the wind turned against them and they had difficulty. They could not actually proceed. They reached an island and they found out that was Malta, and there actually the ship touched the ground. It was shallow. They saw the beach. They thought that was safe, but then the ship ran aground. That was a very serious problem. The ship was stuck in sand, and it was not easy to get it out and make it sail. Meanwhile, the authorities of the ship decided to kill the prisoners and to also reduce the cargo so that the ship would float. But then someone else actually pleaded, and Paul also pleaded on behalf of the prisoners, "If you kill us, you also will not survive." And finally, they decided not to kill the prisoners, but all the cargo was thrown into the sea to reduce the weight, and in that way made the ship float. They continued their sail towards Rome. They passed by Syracuse, Rhegium, and Puteoli. Puteoli is the harbor nearest to Rome. And finally, they reached Rome. When they reached Rome, already the Christians in Rome came to know that Paul was there. Paul was coming to see them, and they marched, they went to receive Paul. They went to Via Appia, the road that leads to Rome, and interestingly, that road is still there, even with some of those old houses and buildings with the same name and number, and Paul was received by the Christians of Rome. They reached a place called the Market of Appia and the 3 Inns. The Christians welcomed them, and Paul was asked to stay there with the Christians for 2 years, and he did that. He was a prisoner, but then he was allowed to stay in his own rented house, and for 2 years Paul lived there. Though prisoner, he had certain freedom. The freedom especially to receive guests. He could not move around much, but at least this much of freedom he was given. And Christians often came to meet him. And from the prison, he continued his evangelization. Many received the message that he gave. Many believed in Jesus and were given baptism. All this was more or less in the year 59 or 60. Imagine, maybe 3-4 years Paul was in preparation. He spent some time to study about Christianity, about Christ, and he found that all that was in the Old Testament foretold about the Messiah, all that is fulfilled in Jesus. And that gave him a real faith which he shared with many, through which many received baptism. Paul was in Rome maybe in the year 60, but then only about 7 years he lived there. In 67, Paul was beheaded in the city of Rome, actually just outside the city of Rome. He was beheaded as part of the persecution that Nero had begun. In those 7 or 8 years, Paul wrote 14 apostolic letters to the churches he founded. And those letters really are a summary of our faith. Lot of elements in our faith are explained in that, starting with the letter to the Romans, where he gives a summary of the Christian faith, and on various occasions where certain needs arose, he wrote a letter to them to explain and to clarify and to strengthen the faith of the Christians. The early Christians really followed Paul's instructions, and they began to live what we can say Christian life. Paul did all this within those 7 years or so. Imagine the amount of preaching he must have done. In 7 years, he could build 14 Christian communities, so to say. Exactly, we don't know that, but more or less in that way. And imagine all this taking place hardly 30 years after Jesus' death. Paul reached Rome. Paul helped the Christian communities to form themselves, and the Christian life started in that way. Along with Paul, more or less that time, Peter reached Rome. We don't know exactly when. The details perhaps in another talk I will give, the history of Peter reaching Rome. What I would like to mention today is only this much, that Peter reached Rome, and according to a very ancient tradition, Paul and Peter both were martyred on the same day. Paul was beheaded outside the gates of Rome. Peter was crucified upside down with the head down. Peter was crucified in the gardens of Nero in the Vatican Hill, and Peter's body was buried there. The tomb which the Christians venerated remains today under the St. Peter's Basilica. With all evidence that we have, it looks that is the real tomb where Peter's body was buried. The burial took place there, but then afterwards the mortal remains were removed from there on June 29 in the year 258, so that the persecutors will not desecrate those tombs. And it is that day that we now celebrate as the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul. We will have a short break. We will come back after a few minutes. Welcome back. I was briefly narrating to you how Paul reached Rome, and along with Paul, Peter also reached Rome. Both were martyred in Rome, not exactly together. Paul just outside Rome, he was beheaded, and Peter was crucified upside down in the Vatican Hills in the garden of Nero. Both were actually killed by Nero's order. With this, I take a break from this narration. I would like to share with you some thoughts about another apostle, the apostle of India, Saint Thomas. Many of you know how Thomas reached India and preached. If we try to understand the details, it's something unimaginable. Thomas landed in Kerala in a place called Kodungallur in AD 52. Remember, Jesus died, let us say, in 33. So, in 20 years, Saint Thomas reached India. Why Kodungallur? Kodungallur was the estuary of the river Periyar. It's a big river, and always there was a lot of water. This river empties itself in the area of Kodungallur. At that time it was known as the port of Muziris, and being an estuary, that was a port both of the sweet water of the river, where the salty water of the Arabian Sea mingle. In high tide, the salty water flows upwards, when in low tide, the sweet water flows down into the sea. That particular port was destroyed totally in the year 1341. There was a huge flood, and because of that, not only the area was submerged, even the landscape almost changed. Now archaeologists are trying to dig out and find out where exactly that port was. It looks that port was about 4 to 5 kilometers away from the place called Kodungallur. They have found some evidence for a harbor, but still they are continuing their research. What is interesting is St. Thomas reached that area, and why St. Thomas went to that area is because there was a strong Jewish community. St. Thomas must have traveled together with the Jews who were traveling, who were business people, and because of that, Thomas must have had that opportunity. Thomas reached that area, Kodungallur, in AD 52. He, within a few years, established Christian communities. According to the Syrian description, St. Thomas established 7.5 churches. That means 7.5 communities. Why a half? Nobody knows. Maybe it was still under formation. The 7.5 churches that St. Thomas started are: one is Kodungallur, second is Kollam, third one is Niranam, fourth one is Chayal, fifth is Kokamangalam, sixth is Kottakkayal, seventh is Palayur, and the half one is called Tiruvithankud. These 7.5 communities, St. Thomas established. He taught them about the Bible, baptized them, and all these within maybe about 10 years. Then he went to Mylapore. Exactly when, we do not know. But then he was martyred in Mylapore, maybe in the year 62. So, such a short while, 72. Only maximum total 20 years St. Thomas worked there. But in those 20 years, St. Thomas established the church in India. Finally, he died a martyr in Mylapore. Thomas tradition is still kept up by the St. Thomas Christians, called St. Thomas because they received the faith from St. Thomas, and a lot of details are there in various literature, mainly in Syriac. The most important one is called the Acts of St. Thomas. That is a book written in Syriac in the 3rd century, 200 and something. And that book gives a lot of the details about St. Thomas' work in India. As an apostle of this part of the country, he really deserves the honor that he is the first one to bring the message of Christ, the message of redemption, and through that he brought Christianity and brought salvation to many. The way Thomas worked is another amazing work. He didn't know the language. So, most likely he got the help of the Jews who knew the local language. Perhaps he also got the support of the Brahmins of the area, who were the only people perhaps who were educated. And therefore, all the work that he did was to that group who could follow him, and the Jews must have helped him to translate his message to the listeners. All these happening in the first century. And imagine, within 20 years, Thomas converted many, established the churches, converted and established Christian worship. Most of it must have been in Syriac. The tradition which he most likely started continued even till about 20 years back. The Holy Eucharist that was celebrated in Kerala, in most parts of Kerala, was either in Syriac, there is an East Syriac and a West Syriac. So, two languages very closely related. And with that Syrian tradition, the Catholics, especially the Roman Catholics, followed that tradition. There are others who follow a slightly different tradition, but then again the Syriac remains the basic language. And the liturgical language was that till, let us say, the Second Vatican Council, with the vernacularization, that was stopped, and the vernacular became the language of our adoration, our Eucharist, our spiritual growth. The Syrian language had its own greatness, and the Syrian Christian community, all the way from the first century, was strong. Even today, they follow that tradition. And therefore, in order to understand the early Christian traditions, we should go back to the Syrian tradition so that we can understand what they believed and followed. And interestingly, the Bible that was translated into Greek in the 3rd century BC was spread all over the world, including Syria. And they still follow that particular Bible, that particular translation, and that is a great wealth. Thank you very much for patiently listening to me. May God bless you.